Welcome to The Bid, where we break down what's happening in the markets and explore the forces changing the economy and finance. I'm Oscar Pulido. Today, we're doing something a little different. Instead of bringing on one guest to unpack one theme, we're looking back at some of the biggest conversations we've had on The Bid so far in 2026, and the themes that kept coming up again and again. To help me do that, I'm joined by someone who knows these episodes better than almost anyone, Stevie Manns, producer of The Bid.
Thank you, Oscar. And as you know, I'm usually behind the scenes, so this is a little different for me too. But as the producer of the show, I'm involved in shaping all of these episodes before we record, working with you. I'm listening during the interviews and then listening again during the edit. And really what stood out to me this year is that even though these episodes covered so many different topics, we went through geopolitics, retirement, AI, crypto, Asia, tokenization. They were all really circling a few big themes.
Well, Stevie, I always love having you on The Bid. You are usually a little bit in the background, but I love when our listeners get to hear you as well. And you're right, this is usually the time of the year where we do a look back, and we often do a best of our favorite episodes. This isn't quite that exactly. This is more of a look at the story of the year and what it's been telling us through these various conversations.
Right. And we're going to go through this chronologically because that was what I found really interesting. You can almost hear this story and these investing themes build from episode to episode. And we obviously started in Davos with geopolitical uncertainty. And then we're going to move into AI as energy security has become a big story, then infrastructure. Market concentration, we've been hearing a lot about portfolio construction, digital assets, tokenization, and then finally the mid-year outlook. And of course, a personal favorite of ours, the tech tour with Tony Kim.
Well, I hope everybody's listened to all these episodes, but just in case they missed a few, don't worry. This is actually a way for those people to catch up. And for those that have listened to all those great topics and conversations that you mentioned, hopefully this gives them a new perspective on how these various themes connect. Okay, so let's start in Davos. Stevie, this is one of the most fun trips we get to take now every year. January, we go to Switzerland. We record live from the World Economic Forum. We did so again this year with Philip Hildebrand and Tom Donnellan, who are both vice chairman of BlackRock. Tom is also chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute. And this episode really sets the tone for the start of the year.
It really does. And that is what struck me when I listened back, just in terms of how big that framing was. This wasn't just there's a lot going on in geopolitics, which of course there is. Tom and Philip were saying we may be living through one of those really rare moments in history where the structure of the global order is actually shifting.
And you know, it's usually a long conversation with these two gentlemen. There's so much to unpack, but there was one particular phrase that Tom used, and it was that phrase, hinge moment, that really stayed with me.
There are moments in history that really do feel like hinge moments. The end of World War II, 1945, obviously, the Arab oil embargo in 1973-74, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. I think 2025, 2026 is going to be one of those moments, a hinge point when really the tectonic plates, geopolitically and in terms of economics, really do change.
And so listening back to that now, it feels like so many of these later episodes were really unpacking what that hinge moment means. We're thinking AI, supply chains, defense, energy, portfolios, and all of those stories really connect back to a world that feels much less stable and much less predictable.
And right after Davos, we actually went to a very different but equally important topic, and that's retirement, where the theme was very much about preparation. In our Ask Me Anything episode, I spoke with Jamie Majera, who is head of BlackRock's U.S. Wealth Advisory and Retirement businesses. On the surface, this was a very personal finance episode, but I think it connected to the bigger theme of the year, which is how do you prepare when the future is uncertain?
And Jamie gave us one of the clearest lines of the year with regard to retirement. And she said, retirement isn't an ending, it's a choice. But that choice, of course, needs to be planned for.
For me, retirement is the choice to do what's next. It's the freedom to do what's next. So it could mean the choice to start a business or the choice to go back to school or the choice to travel the world, do charity, philanthropy, but it's a choice. And in order to have that choice, you actually need to have a plan.
And that idea of having a plan rather than trying to predict everything ends up coming back in our investment episodes too.
Yes. And then the next big turn of the year, of course, was AI. But not AI in the abstract. AI as something that needs power, needs infrastructure, it needs capital, and also, of course, physical resources.
So, Stevie, we had Will Su back on the show. Will is an expert in the energy sector, and he came back on to talk about AI and energy, the intersection of those two topics. And this was one of those episodes where I remember thinking, this is not just a technology story anymore.
Mm-hmm. That was my reaction as well. And when I was producing that, it really stood out about how Will reframed AI. It's so easy to think of AI as just software, but Will made it really physically tangible. Power grids, natural gas, renewables, nuclear, data centers, and suddenly AI became this really physical thing.
And similar to other guests, he had a really memorable line. Will always has a very creative way of synthesizing things. And like some of our other guests, he also had a very memorable line, something that really stuck with me. He said, we've historically known that knowledge is power, but for the first time ever, power is knowledge.
These improvements are coming with an exponential increase in power demand. So even with some of the efficiency gains that we have made on the semiconductor side, the reality is today's AI models are more power hungry than ever to create. On our last episode, we talked about the concept of zettaflops. So let me introduce a new term. Today, we are firmly marching into the world of yottaflop compute. That's 1 trillion calculations per second. Again, just mind-bending numbers. And of course, each calculation just involves the movement of electrons between the semiconductor chips. So over time, that power demand really starts to add up and grow exponentially. I like to think of it this way. Since the beginning of human history, knowledge is power. But for the first time ever, power is knowledge.
And that episode was a turning point editorially. And obviously, when we're planning episodes, we're not just planning singular episodes, we're planning them on the whole. And after that, almost every conversation on AI had to answer the second question, not just what can AI do, but what does it take to really build it?
So that brings us to the equity market. In episode 257 in March, I spoke with Ibrahim Kanan, who's head of the U.S. core equity team within BlackRock's Fundamental Equities Group. And we talked about the S&P 493, or as he called it, the best of the rest.
Right. And this episode was really important because it showed how the AI story was affecting the shape of the markets themselves. We talked so much about the Magnificent Seven, but Ibrahim really helped explain what investors might be missing beneath the surface or under the hood, I think, as he said.
Yeah, and he also made the point that the concentration in the S&P 500 index has really reached an extreme relative to history.
This is the most concentrated that the S&P has ever been. It's that simple. We've never had a period of time where the top 10 stocks were 40% of the index. And it's really important because we're used to thinking that the S&P 500 is broad and diversified, right? It's 500 companies. You think, okay, I'm getting exposure to 500 companies. But the reality today is that it's really dominated by these 10 companies.
And that clip really gets to something that we kept hearing across the year, in that diversification isn't something that can be assumed anymore. Even things that may look diversified on the surface may be much more concentrated than investors realize.
Which takes us directly to episode 258 and portfolio construction. I spoke with Vivek Paul, who is head of portfolio research and UK chief investment strategist at the BlackRock Investment Institute. This was one of those episodes that pulled a lot of our year-to-date themes together.
Right. And from a listener perspective, I think this felt like the now what, the so what moment for investors. We know geopolitics is changing. AI is changing the markets. Concentration is rising. So what does it actually mean for an investor, and what should they be doing differently?
Right. And Vivek's answer was that some of the old portfolio anchors and assumptions may not work the same way.
I think the dynamic now is different. We've talked, Oscar, in the past about this being a different regime economically. This is an environment where some of those macro anchors that we've relied upon for generation just aren't holding in quite the same way. Think of all those things that we've just come to rely upon, like the stability of inflation, the way in which policy is conducted on the domestic stage, on the international stage, the sort of level of indebtedness and the path of the fiscal for many of these big governments. It's not the same environment that we have had in the past.
That episode gave us new language of being more dynamic and more granular, which is a term that Vivek used, which became really useful later on when we were talking about Asia and crypto and, of course, tokenization.
Well, Stevie, then we packed our bags again. We went on the road, this time somewhere a little bit warmer. We went to Miami in April for BlackRock's Latin America Investment Forum, where I spoke with Robbie Mitchnick, head of digital assets at BlackRock, and Dan Moorhead, CEO of Pantera Capital.
I love producing live episodes, and crypto is one of those topics that can be really polarizing, but the conversation wasn't just is crypto up or down, is this another AI winter? It was much more about market structure, adoption, and where digital assets might fit into portfolios in the future, and now.
Right, and Robbie, I thought, really captured the dual nature of Bitcoin really well.
On the one hand, it's clearly a risky asset on a standalone basis, right? It's still relatively novel technology, it's volatile. On the other hand, it has a very unique set of properties that give it, I would say, a distinct set of long-term risk and return drivers from just about anything else in your portfolio, right? It's global, it's non-sovereign, it's decentralized, it's scarce. It exists outside of any one country's political, economic, fiscal, monetary risk factors.
And Robbie's framing of on the one hand, on the other hand, is probably the fairest way to talk about crypto because, of course, it's not risk-free. And it's also not a speculative headline anymore.
Right. I think one of the takeaways from that episode for me is that crypto is now much more of a mainstream conversation and certainly something that we've featured more within the bid. Well, then we packed our bags again. And if you can believe it, we went somewhere that was actually even warmer than Miami and further afield, and that's Singapore. In episode 261, I spoke with Arti Angara, who's head of global product solutions in the Asia Pacific region for BlackRock.
And this was one of the episodes where location really mattered. And I loved Singapore, as you know. I've told everyone how much I loved it. And you can really hear it in the conversation because Asia wasn't being discussed as this abstract future growth story or emerging markets idea. It was being discussed as something that is already central to global portfolios.
That's right. Arti, I think, reminded people just how relevant Asia is in the context of global portfolios and the investment opportunity set. And she laid out 3 reasons: scale, relevance, and a change in investor mindset.
40% of global GDP, and that's up from 20% as recently as 1990. And interestingly, Asia's also home to more than 50% of the listed companies in the world. So it really isn't a future story anymore. It really is here and now.
So from the bid's perspective, this was another broadening moment. The story of the year isn't just AI in the US, it's also where growth, supply chains, manufacturing, domestic consumption, and diversification are showing up much more globally.
Well, then we moved on from what investors own to how markets themselves may operate. And in episode 264, I spoke with Rob Goldstein, the bid's original guest, and also the chief operating officer at BlackRock, and we talked about tokenization.
Rob Goldstein, the bid's #1 guest, quite literally. This was one of those episodes where the topic could sound very technical, but Rob made it very practical. It's about access, it's about efficiency, and the idea that financial market infrastructure might be entering a new phase.
And I agree with that. I think if you had told me a couple years ago we were going to talk about this topic called tokenization, I would have assumed it would be hard to follow. But I think Rob did a great job of making it very accessible. And he really framed tokenization as the next technology in a long line of technologies that reduce friction.
You could think about the mutual fund was a technology. We spoke about the ETF being a technology several times. And the token is just another technology. The token is a concept that effectively lets you have a representation of a stock, a bond, a fund, your house, whatever it may be, as a digital certificate that could be held in a wallet.
And of course, when we're talking about tokenization, it connects back to crypto, but it also goes well beyond crypto. It's about the infrastructure of markets, and that's been the theme that we've seen so much this year. Energy infrastructure, market infrastructure, and of course, portfolio infrastructure.
So by the time we got to the mid-year outlook, the conversation had evolved again. I spoke with Jean Bovin, who's head of the BlackRock Investment Institute, about this concept of scarcity versus abundance in the age of AI.
And this felt very much like a checkpoint episode. In January, we were asking, how big could AI become? By mid-year, the question had shifted to whether the system can actually supply what AI needs: power, capital, infrastructure, and labor.
And I also remember Jean introducing another useful term, a word we don't hear very much, which is polyfurcation.
Sometimes on the bid, we hear new words for the first time, and I often think that they have been made up. But no, this was a real word, and Jean used it.
Polyfurcated really means a different type of uncertainty that cannot be easily handled by having a base case with some uncertainty around it. You need to handle multiple scenarios always and keep track of them.
And that idea from Jean really sums up the year. It's not just uncertainty, it's multiple plausible futures all at once. And that makes the job of building portfolios even harder.
Right. It goes back to your point of diversification is just harder to find, and it may not be as obvious or as visible as it was in some past market regimes. And finally, the tech tour. This is one of my favorite episodes. We had a chance to actually travel on the tech tour this year with Tony Kim and many BlackRock colleagues. Tony is, of course, the head of the global technology team within BlackRock Fundamental Equities. And we took this tour across San Francisco and Silicon Valley.
Right. And this was so fun because this was the first year that you joined me on the tech tour. You were on the bus, and I think you were just there for a day, just on the Wednesday. And one thing that you said was, wow, this is a lot. These are busy days that you guys have.
Right. I only did one day. I know that the broader team, yourself included, did all 5 days. So it really is a commitment. But part of what you get out of that is all of these great conversations with industry leaders. And what struck me was that AI, the conversation is not just about models and software. We met with companies where we're talking about space, robotics, autonomous vehicles, energy, chips, optics, cooling, the whole stack. There's a lot of terminology. In fact, I found myself Googling terminology a lot of times when we're in these meetings just to make sure I could keep up.
And to make sure they're real words and not just made up, right? And Tony also gave us one of the clearest explanations of why scarcity keeps showing up in the AI story.
Everything is short. Everything is constrained. Everything is scarce. Not everything, but most things. And then you throw at that these 250 Manhattan equivalent demand over the next 5 years. And this is the situation we're in. That is the world of scarcity.
So that really brings us almost full circle, Stevie. We started the year talking about hinge moments with Tom Donilon, structural shifts, and by the time of the tech tour, we were seeing those shifts show up in the physical demands of AI.
Right. And looking back, what stands out to me is that these episodes weren't disconnected. And one of the reasons I felt we should do this particular episode tying them all together, they were really building on each other. And Davos gave us that geopolitical backdrop. Will Su made AI physical. Ibrahim and Vivek showed us how markets and portfolios are adapting. Robbie, Dan, Artie, and Rob Goldstein showed how the opportunity set and financial system are broadening. And Jean and Tony helped us understand where the debate is now in terms of scarcity, abundance, and how investors can prepare for both.
I have to admit, even though I'm the host sitting in the chair recording all these episodes, this is even helping me understand how all of these distinct conversations really tie together. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from the first part of 2026. The world is changing quickly, but the job of investors hasn't changed entirely. It's still about understanding the forces shaping markets, staying disciplined, and building portfolios that can adapt.
Exactly. And from the producer's chair, the theme I kept hearing was not try to predict the future. Instead, it was prepare for different versions of it, which sounds a little bit like science fiction and talking about the multiverse. But really, that was the clearest message that I've heard so far this year.
Well, I think that's well said, this theme of preparation. And that's really what we're striving to do here in these conversations, is to help our listeners prepare for all the various topics that they come across in financial markets. Thanks for joining us for this special behind-the-scenes episode of The Bid. If you missed any of the conversations we talked about today, you can find them in the show notes. We'll be back with more conversations on the forces changing the economy and finance. Make sure you subscribe to The Bid wherever you get your podcasts.
This content is for informational purposes only and is not an offer or a solicitation. Reliance upon information in this material is at the sole discretion of the listener. Reference to the names of each company mentioned is merely for explaining the investment strategy and should not be construed as investment advice or recommendation. The views expressed by third-party speakers are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of BlackRock, nor should they be interpreted as an endorsement by BlackRock. In the UK and non-European Economic Area countries, this is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. In the European Economic Area, this is authorised and regulated by the Netherlands Authority for the Financial Markets. For full disclosures, visit blackrock.com/corporate/compliance/bid-disclosures.